Most people think breaking a code is the hard part. It isn't. The hard part is what you do the moment after, when you know something terrible is coming. And using what you know might cost you the very secret that let you know it. On the night of the 14th of November, 1940, a city in the English Midlands was about to be destroyed. And somewhere in Buckinghamshire, in a requisitioned country house surrounded by huts and barbed wire, a small group of British codebreakers had already read a piece of the German signal that pointed toward it. What that signal actually said and what it didn't has been argued over for more than 70 years. I'll come back to that. Because to understand what those words really meant and what they didn't mean, you need to understand what it took just to be able to read them at all. I'm Arthur Finch. Let's start with the place, Bletchley Park, 50 miles northwest of London. A Victorian mansion that nobody particularly liked the look of. Even at the time, people called it ugly, surrounded by lawns that were rapidly filled with wooden huts thrown up in a hurry as the war demanded more space than the house could give. By the autumn of 1940, several hundred people worked there. Mathematicians, chess champions, linguists, crossword setters, women operating machinery that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. Their job was singular and almost absurd in its difficulty: to read the German military's most secret communications, encrypted on a machine called Enigma. Enigma looked, on the surface, like an oversized typewriter in a wooden box. Press a key, and an electrical signal passed through a set of rotating wheels, rotors, before lighting up a different letter entirely. Press the same key again, and a different letter lit up because the rotors had moved. The number of possible settings ran into the hundreds of trillions. The Germans were not wrong to trust it. For most of human history, a cipher of that complexity, changed daily, would have been simply unreadable. The flaw was never really mathematical. The flaw was human. And that's where this story actually begins. In the 1930s, a Polish mathematician named Marian Rejewski had already made the first crucial breakthrough, reconstructing the internal wiring of the Enigma machine using intercepted traffic and a small amount of intelligence obtained from a French source. When Poland fell in 1939, Rejewski and his colleagues passed everything they had to the British and French. It's a detail that gets lost too often. Bletchley Park did not start from nothing. It started from a Polish gift, carried out of a collapsing country at the worst possible moment. And it's worth saying that plainly before going further. What the British added was scale, machinery, and a particular kind of obsessive methodical thinking. Alan Turing, then in his late 20s, designed an electromechanical device called the bomb. Not a bomb in the explosive sense, the name has a more mundane origin. Built to test thousands of possible rotor settings far faster than any human could. It didn't break Enigma by magic. It broke it by elimination, by narrowing trillions of possibilities down to a number small enough that a person could finish the job by hand. The work was slow, exhausting, and entirely dependent on the Germans making small human mistakes. A careless operator using a girlfriend's initials as a setting, a weather report sent in a predictable format, the same greeting at the start of a message day after day. Code breaking at this level was not a single flash of genius. It was thousands of small acts of pattern recognition, repeated relentlessly by people who rarely saw the larger picture of what they were reading. By the summer of 1940, Bletchley was reading some German Luftwaffe traffic with real consistency. Not everything, not always quickly enough to matter, but enough that, for the first time, Britain had a window, however narrow and however delayed, into what the German Air Force intended to do next. Here's where you need to hold on to something. This intelligence had a name, Ultra. And Ultra came with a rule that sat above almost every other rule in British wartime intelligence. The source had to be protected at all costs. Not because the information itself was the only thing of value, but because if the Germans ever suspected their cipher had been broken, they would change it and the entire advantage would disappear overnight. So a structure was built around Ultra, a deliberate, careful set of practices designed to make sure that nothing Britain did with this intelligence could ever, by itself, revealed that the intelligence existed. Before any ultra-derived warning could be acted on, in most cases, a second independent source had to confirm it. A reconnaissance flight, a different intercept, a prisoner's statement, something that gave the enemy an alternative explanation for how the British seemed to know what they knew.
Keep that structure in mind. It matters more than it sounds like right now.
Because it's the lens through which everything in Coventry has to be read. In early November of 1940, Bletchley intercepted and decrypted a German order referring to an operation with the code name Moonlight Sonata, Mondschein Sonate. The decrypted message indicated a major air operation, timed to a full moon, intended as a concentrated strike using Pathfinder aircraft to mark targets with incendiaries ahead of a much larger bomber force. This was a real document. It exists. It has been examined by historians for decades. What it did not contain, in the form intelligence officers initially had it, was an explicit, unambiguous target name. This is the detail the popular version of this story almost always leaves out. And it's the detail that matters most. The Air Ministry's intelligence assessment, working from the Moonlight Sonata decrypt alongside other intercepted material, produced a list of possible targets. Several British cities appeared on versions of that list at different points, among them London, and at various stages other major industrial centres. Coventry, with its concentration of aircraft and munitions factories, was a plausible target. But plausible is not the same as confirmed. The historical reality, drawn from the post-war accounts of intelligence officers who worked the case and from the cabinet papers later released, is that there was no single clean decrypt that read, in effect, Coventry tonight. What existed was a set of fragments, urgent and serious, but genuinely ambiguous about the precise location.
I want to be careful here because this is exactly the point where a story like this usually gets simplified into something cleaner and more dramatic than the truth, and a less honest version of this story would. The persistent claim, repeated in books, in documentaries, occasionally stated as settled fact, is that Winston Churchill knew with certainty that Coventry was the target and chose to let the city burn rather than risk exposing that Enigma had been broken. It is a powerful story. It assigns a terrible, almost unbearable moral weight to one man in one room making one decision. And it is not what the documentary record actually supports. Wait. Let's slow down because this is the part that matters. The strongest and most carefully sourced account of what happened that day comes from Frederick Winterbotham, one of the intelligence officers most directly involved in handling ultra material, in his post-war memoir. According to Winterbotham, on the morning of the 14th, the indications pointed toward a major raid that night, and London was considered the most likely target, given the pattern of previous attacks and the ambiguous wording of the available intercepts. Coventry was on the list of possibilities being tracked, but it was not the leading candidate in the assessment as it stood that morning. Other historians who have gone back through the Air Ministry's records, including F.H. Hinsley, who later wrote the official multi-volume history of British intelligence in the Second World War, reached a similar conclusion. The specific, unambiguous identification of Coventry as the night's target did not exist in a form clean enough to act on with confidence, certainly not early enough in the day to organize a full defensive response. You'd assume, with 70 years of hindsight and the benefit of every released document, that this question would be settled by now. You'd be wrong. It remains one of the most argued over points in the history of British wartime intelligence. And serious historians still disagree, not about whether the Germans intended to hit Coventry, they did, but about precisely when British intelligence could have known that and with what degree of certainty. Here's the human cost underneath the historiography, and it deserves to be said plainly, without softening it. That night, German bombers, more than 400 aircraft, in waves, using the Moonlight Sonata plan exactly as the decrypted order had described, dropped incendiaries to mark the city, then followed with high explosive and more incendiaries for over 10 hours. Coventry's medieval cathedral, standing since the 14th century, was burned to its outer walls. Roughly 568 people were killed. Over 1,000 more were injured. Tens of thousands were left without homes in a city that by morning had a new word attached to it in German propaganda. Coventrieren, to coventrate, meaning to flatten a city entirely from the air. It was used as a boast. This is the part that matters, so I'll say it plainly. Whatever the precise state of British knowledge that morning, and the honest answer is that it was partial, ambiguous, and arrived too late and too uncertain to organize a full-scale defense, even if every possible resource had been thrown at it. The people of Coventry paid the price for a war being fought, in part, in a dimension they could never have seen. A war of signals, fragments, and a cipher machine 300 miles away in Buckinghamshire that almost nobody in Britain even knew existed. So where does that leave the question this video opened with? Did Churchill knowingly sacrifice Coventry to protect Ultra? The most rigorously sourced answer, built from Hinsley's official history and from the intelligence officers who were actually in the room, is this. The choice Churchill is popularly accused of making was never actually presented to him in the clean, binary form the legend describes. He was not handed a slip of paper that said, "Coventry will burn tonight," and asked to choose between a city and a secret. What he had that morning was an intelligence picture that was serious, alarming, and incomplete, pointing toward a major raid somewhere soon, without giving the kind of specific, actionable certainty that would have let the government redirect the nation's air defenses to one city over all the others being watched that same week. The tragedy of Coventry was not a single moral failure in a single decision. It was the structural cost of a system designed, deliberately and necessarily, to keep an intelligence source alive long enough to help win the war. A system that, by its very design, could almost never deliver perfect, timely certainty. Because demanding that certainty too often would have exposed the source it depended on. That is the trade Ultra was built on, every single day it operated, not just on the 14th of November. Protect the source and accept that some warnings will arrive too vague or too late or not at all. Use the source too freely, too precisely, too often, and lose it entirely, along with everything it might have told you about the next attack, and the one after that, and the ones that mattered even more. Think about that for a moment, because it reframes the entire question. The people running Ultra were not choosing that one night between a city and a secret. They were living inside a standing policy that had already decided, in the abstract, that the secret had to survive almost any single cost, because the alternative was a Britain blind to nearly all of it. Not just to Coventry, but to everything Ultra would go on to reveal for the rest of the war. D-Day's deception plan, the hunt for German U-boats in the Atlantic, the movement of divisions on the Eastern Front, shared selectively with the Soviets. None of that exists in the history we know if Enigma had been exposed and changed in November of 1940 over one city, however terrible that night was. It's a cold kind of arithmetic to write down, and I don't think it should be written down comfortably. Historians who defend the Ultra security policy are not arguing that Coventry didn't matter. They're arguing that the policy was built for a war where every single decrypted fragment carried that same terrible weight, multiplied across years, across theaters, across a secret that, had it been lost, might have changed the outcome of the war itself. Historians who push back on that framing point out, fairly, that this kind of utilitarian reasoning is always easiest to make from a distance, in hindsight, by people who were not standing in the wreckage of a cathedral the next morning. Both things are true at once. That's not a comfortable place to leave a story, but it's an honest one. What happened at Bletchley Park after that night tells you something too. The work didn't stop, it accelerated. Within 2 years, Ultra intelligence was feeding directly into the Battle of the Atlantic, helping British convoys avoid U-boat concentrations that Bletchley's codebreakers had located by reading German naval Enigma traffic. A much harder cipher to crack than the Luftwaffe's, solved in large part because of the work of Turing and his colleagues in a hut that, by most accounts, was cold, cramped, and almost monastically quiet.
Some historians estimate that the intelligence flowing from Bletchley Park shortened the war in Europe by a significant margin. The precise figure is debated, and any number attached to a war's length is necessarily an estimate, not a fact. But the consensus among serious historians is that the effect was substantial, and that it saved a great many more lives than were lost on any single night, including the 14th of November, 1940.
That doesn't undo Coventry.
It isn't supposed to. It's simply the rest of the ledger, and any honest account of this story has to hold both entries at once. I think about what it must have been like to work at Bletchley Park in those years, knowing fragments of catastrophes before they happened, and knowing too that you could rarely act on what you knew without risking everything else you might come to know afterward. Most of the people who worked there never spoke about it publicly. Many took the secret to their graves decades later, simply because they had given their word, and that word mattered to them more than any credit they might have claimed. There's a particular kind of courage in that. Not the courage of the battlefield, but the quieter, longer kind. Living for years with knowledge you cannot use, in service of a war you cannot discuss, for people who will never know your name.
Coventry was rebuilt. The old cathedral's ruins were left standing, deliberately, beside the new one built after the war, not as a monument to despair, but, in the words inscribed there, as a sign of reconciliation. The two buildings stand side by side today, the burned stone and the new stone, and you can read that, if you want to, as the whole story in miniature. What it cost, what it became, and the gap between certainty and knowledge that on one night in November, no one, not Churchill, not Bletchley Park, not the people of Coventry themselves, ever fully closed in time. I'm Arthur Finch. If you'd like to go on thinking about moments like this one with others who take this period as seriously as you do, there's a link to our community in the description. No pressure, just an open door if you'd like to walk through it.